Good morning. X Winterview, back with another brief dialogue with his dear friend, Annastacey. As usual, driving to work in das Auto as fast as he can, because he's a good employee. Today's brief dialogue, by special request, is about facing the unfaceable, how to face that which you cannot face. It's a little bit of a violation of principle in a way, gonna be a bit instructional. I don't usually give instructions to people. What do I know? What do I know? But sometimes life is tough, and it feels nice that you feel that you might have something to do, I guess. So, a little departure from the usual topic to talk about unpleasant experiences that you cannot face. And I'll somehow bend it back into the greater subject, non-duality and enlightenment, perhaps. I suppose it's worth mentioning from the outset, this is a topic I covered in a previous dialogue, that purification and liberation are not the same thing, but are very commonly overlapping subjects in this field. The belief being something along the lines of, if I get rid of all my negative stuff, I will be rewarded with a big positive thing, hopefully enlightenment. If I get rid of all my fear and anger and anxiety, I will get enlightened, or it'll be more likely to happen. Something along those lines. Completely fallacious thinking. So I thought I'd throw that out there at the start to disappoint. Why not? If I'm not disappointing, I'm not doing my job. So, let's have a little chat. You and me. A little one-to-one therapy, if you like. Me and the seeker. The seeker and I. We know that the seeker exists conceptually. Yes, we've heard that before 100 times, X. We know that. But it doesn't do me any good. I cannot stop it. True. That is true. Seeking happens. Seeking goes on. Within the realm of the seeker, there's a lot of struggle, a lot of upheaval, a lot of difficulty. The seeker, obviously thinking it was born, is worried it will one day die, and clings tenaciously to that life that it thinks it needs to cling to. In the story of the life of that seeker, the seeker exists in what I call fantasy. It's a dream life, in a sense. A way of psychically defending against the awfulness of the eventual demise, the annihilation of self. I've talked about that in another brief dialogue too. Everything I'm talking about now, I think I've talked about before. I think. So, one of the most common fantasies is to avoid the awfulness of one's annihilation, is somehow clinging to a desperate hope that one will cheat death, become immortal, and so on and so forth. Obviously in the hopes of living forever as the ultimate fantasy. Anything that occurs in the fantasy that disrupts or annoys, or you might say tries to derail the fantasy, is often not tolerated very well. It's not part of the fantasy that I'm going to be sick and lame and friendless and all that. And there's a lot of good work that one can do on the shadow self in a way of finding relief in the story of their lives. And I think I've done a dialogue on the shadow, but maybe I should revisit that. But when a feeling or an uncomfortable sensation arises in the fantasy of the seeker, it's very frequently not tolerated, it's not acceptable in some way. We cannot face it. So, from our research in psychology, we know there's a few clever little tricks that the mind pulls to get rid of negativity. You've probably heard of these terms. One of the most common ways is to repress or to suppress one's negative emotions. Repression being more of an unconscious process, something the mind just does before you can even consider it, and the suppression, which is a sort of considered way of squishing down those uncomfortable feelings. But interestingly, the feeling suppressed or repressed does not go away, it doesn't go anywhere. It is, what's a good word? Sublimated? Is that a good word? I don't know. Integrated, hangs around, goes into a feedback loop. It stays. That feeling does not go anywhere. Which is annoying. You thought you got rid of it. Hey. Oh well. So, it's out of sight, out of mind, which is great. Fantasy can continue without that awful negative feeling bothering you. Some people kind of go the opposite way. You've got these suppressors who squish down their negative feelings. Out of sight, out of mind. Then you've got those crazy kids who want to express their feelings. Let them out. I'm feeling angry. I'm going to express my anger today. I'm the angry anger person. Rah, kind of thing. That's a interesting tactic, but doesn't often have the desired effect with that feeling. It, in some ways, can become incorporated into the character, into the mental energy field, if you like, of the individual, and become quite disruptive. Not to mention the fact that it can be a disruptive emotion when you express it. It can cause all sorts of problems. And it's in other ways, it's dumping your negativity on someone else, not taking ownership for one's negativity. So you have to be cautious. Not saying it's a terrible idea, just tread lightly with the old, I'm going to express myself, totally, kind of thing. And what else do we do? My old favourite, all-time fave, personal choice of mine throughout my childhood, you might say, and many of you will relate to this one, is to avoid, get away from, escape from one's difficult feelings. What's funny is that we'll often describe events that we want to get away from, people we want to get away from, but we forget very easily that we're simply avoiding feelings. We'll call it, we'll give it a description, the event. You know, I had to run away from school because it was terrible, but school is a neutral or benign entity, isn't it? It's not positive or negative. The way we feel about the school, it's what we're running away from. So at all times we're responding to our own inner emotional states based on our interpretation of the external world. And of course this, if you're a therapist, psychologist, etc., you probably know this sort of stuff already. It's kind of the basis for a lot of therapies, especially cognitive behavioral therapy, where we look at the interpretation of events rather than the event in and of itself. So, more or less, those are the basic sort of ways we get away from things we cannot face. But should we face them? Or what should we do to face the negativity? It's interesting that when we avoid something or squish or repress or whatever, it's not into neutrality. We don't just repress and get on with our day. We often do it's like double sellotape, double sticky tape over a problem. We put two pieces just to make sure that that problem sticks down and is gone. We avoid and we will approach something else. And this is another psychological model of pardon me, can't even speak this morning, approach and avoidance. So we, let's say, avoid school because it's awful, let's say, or as we have now learned, our interpretation of school is such that it is not nice and now we feel unpleasant. But that's half the story. What do we do instead? We don't just benignly float nowhere. We need to seal the deal by approaching something that we find in some way represents the positive opposite, you could say. So let's say it's the child who skips school, skips class. They feel like they're getting bullied, perhaps. They feel the negative stares and all that off the other kids in the class, so they just can't bear it anymore. So they avoid the class, and they perhaps go and watch a movie or go read a book, go listen to music, just go walking in the woods by themselves near the school, perhaps. They're sort of going into a bit of whimsy, a bit of fantasy. So there's the positive side, the flip side of the avoidance strategy, you could say. Twofold. So at all times in this game, you might say, we're avoiding something while approaching something else. Can we face stuff? Is it possible to face the unfaceable? Or why would we even bother in the first place? One of the reasons to mention it, it's just a bit of good mental health, you could say, because that's my field, hey. That, in some ways we could link it back to the whole Enlightenment Non-duality thing, in that it harkens back to something in experience is not acceptable. Experience is judged as unacceptable in some way. What's not realized is that it's already in experience. It's already arisen. The judgment is coming second, and it is appearing inside the experience, if that makes sense to you. The space that I am, that empty, awake, clear space, has no judgment over experience itself. It allows everything equally, including judgment. So my judgment appears in that space. The awful event appears in that space. The horrific event appears in that space. It's all allowed. Nothing is in the way of that space, you could say. And when it comes to a movement to feel better, to help the character, as I've been talking about a little bit earlier, the movement itself happens in that space. It's not a good or bad thing that I'm going to help an apparent individual. That's just another movement in the space. And to help an imagined seeker with emotional problems is something that happens in that space. And it's, in some ways it's wonderful because it's a nice story that happens, but in another sense it's completely meaningless as well. It's just a so what? The appearance of a seeker with problems and someone seeming to help them. So what? It means nothing more grand in the big scale of the universe, in the grand scale of the universe. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It's a flick of an eyelid. So what we're talking about is the story. We're looking into the story and playing around with the story. Remembering, I guess, that the story has no impact on awakeness itself. Nothing I do in the story is going to change the fact of my awakeness. I think I've belabored that point, but I think it's a confusing point in a lot of teachings about liberation, non-duality, where a teacher might encourage someone to meditate, or to surrender negativity, or to, change their diet. It's as if what they're saying is, if we change the movie on the screen, we'll somehow change the light of the projector. It's not going to happen. So, anyway, with that caveat in mind and my little plug for non-duality, enlightenment out of the way, let's move forward and give that seeker a helping hand while they still think there's something wrong. To address or to face that which cannot be faced, I guess a good starting point is to recognize that everything that has appeared in that space, in that aware, awake consciousness, you could say even, is in some ways on a more fundamental level, it's okay. It's alright. It's not a problem. On a relative level, it's a problem. It feels unpleasant. It can cause the body distress and sickness in some cases. So here we are as seekers, repressing, suppressing, acting out, or even avoiding things we don't like. So let's take a leaf out of the book of consciousness. If consciousness had a book, and first acknowledge that it's okay. That the negativity that we think is interrupting our fantasy life is in some ways okay. Just broadly speaking. Whenever we avoid, we approach something at the same time. We can look at the behaviors in either or, two ways. In that we recognize what we're approaching and decide to turn around and look at what we're avoiding. And own it in a sense too. It's very tempting to blame the world, to blame an outside agency. And it's sometimes so hard to not see it as an outside agency that, it sounds preposterous what I'm suggesting. So we'll maybe choose a few examples to get a sense of it. Let's roll with a sort of, we'll call it not an easy one necessarily, but an easier one to comprehend. Let's choose work, always a good place to start. Work. Let's say there's a promotion coming up at work, and there's about 3 or 4 of you that could get that promotion, or are sort of in that field that one might be selected over another. And on the day of the selection, it turns out that you're not selected. And it hurts, really hurts, but you want to be the consummate professional. You want to sort of rationalize that pain away quickly. Hey, the other guy or gal was way more qualified, they're a better fit. I didn't really want that position. I didn't want the responsibility at the end of the day. I just wanted to stay where I was. There's more I need to learn in my current role. I feel that I need to mature a bit more, and all those rationalizations straight away. Or maybe there's bitterness, like really angry, damn it, I work harder than Bill down the hall, who's always flirting with the ladies and not doing his job, and can't they see he's a pain in the bum and he's terrible for that position? Acting out, ranting, expressing your feelings, coming up to Bill and telling him he's no good, he stole your job and he'll regret the day that he saw you, la la la, and all that. Acting out. Or avoiding, just quietly, meekly slinking off into the shadows of the office, plotting revenge maybe. Or just quietly, benignly smiling to yourself. It's okay. I'm fine. I didn't want that job. I like working in the same position for years and years and years without any recognition or pay rise in a job I hate that is crushing my soul. I'm good. Something like that. So we look quickly at the techniques of avoidance. What are we avoiding straight off the bat? We're avoiding the pain, in a way, of disappointment. We're disappointed. We didn't get the job. It's, in some ways, it seems to have devalued us. We feel that we're worth a little bit less. We're not worth as much as Bill or Sue or whoever, in that they got the position over us. It means that we're not as smart as them, perhaps. Not as good looking, even, could come up in your mind. Not as popular, perhaps. There's something wrong with us. We never get anything good. Our life is awful. So there's that little pang of pain that interrupts the fantasy somehow. The fantasy that we're living a good life. This is a nice life that I've carved out for myself. Suddenly, it's not such a good life, is it? So there's step one. You just looked at the actual thing that's being avoided or repressed or suppressed or whatever. And then you sort of recognize the little pattern of what you do to make it okay, what you get attracted to. I'll just throw myself into my work harder. I'll work double time. I'll leave early in a sort of passive-aggressive protest. They don't want me? Fine. I don't want them. I'll do what I want. Sort of thing. You all know the passive-aggressive. And this is another thing we can recognize, the little things we do to cope, our little coping strategies, you could say. Then, what do? Well, we can do two things, really. But I like to go back to the core vulnerability. That's where I like to look. I always like to look there, to face that, because that is what is unfaceable. The meaning for the self, the meaning for this conceptual self of this event. And you could, some people say you look at it and you let go, perhaps, of the negativity, but I have an easier way, and a fun way too. This is the way that makes me laugh, makes other people that I work with laugh, to face the unfaceable. Let's go back to that core vulnerability, which in this instance, let's say it was, what did I say it was? I've forgotten already. That I'm no good, that I'm useless, that this character is useless or not worth very much. And this is where it becomes fun. The uselessness is an endearing trait. You could say, if you went to see a movie, imagine watching a movie with the useless character, this sort of no-hoper, this never gets ahead. Everyone's always one-upping this character. This is a funny character in a way. This is the sort of sweet, trying hard to make it, but not quite making it character. That's a role that's available at all times, and I'm not suggesting that you take that up as your lifestyle choice, but you can entertain yourself as that, even as a mental exercise. It works very well to allow that, in a sense, to stop resisting that vulnerable, the loser part of yourself, you could say. I'm a loser. That's it. I'm just a loser. And then getting into it for a while, like really getting into being a loser. Accepting, you could say, your loserness. Now it can be very challenging, because in psychological terms, the superego might not like this. It's rubbing up against the image I have of myself as capable, dynamic, smart, urbane, blah blah blah, which points to an illusion or delusion we're trying to hold about ourselves. And this job opportunity that we failed has reminded us that we cannot hold up these images. And then let's throw in a Bible quote. Why not? Why not throw in a Bible quote in the middle of this talk? I can't remember the quote. Something about worshipping false gods, graven images, something along those lines. We won't worship false gods, which is a bit of wisdom in that. And that's what we're doing. We're trying to worship a false god. We're worshipping ourselves as an image that is unreal. Going to pause for a sec. I'm going to continue this in a part 2. Going to get a coffee and come back to this in a part 2. Stand tuned. Stand by and stay tuned.